Briefly, I don't emphasize that, but I absolutely mention that this is not necessarily the intention of all of this technology, is to track people.
Well, and they're mandated, or
Yeah,
mandated to
with
put
the
that
E911.
information in there so that people can find them during emergency, so emergency responders, when you call on a cell phone, know where you are.
That's right.
So that it's not, it's the benefit and the risk, right,
Yeah.
associated with it.
Yeah, I could probably do a better job of doing the E911. It's a huge point. Exactly right.
So thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to talk today about the role of the IRB, and I'm going to be echoing a lot of themes that we've talked about. I'm going to try and stay on track on time here, but the biggest theme that I've heard a lot about today that I'm going to be echoing really is that it's an evolving field, even in the biomedical sciences, on how we use geospatial data. And so I think there's a role for everyone here today to play to help inform that theme. So first I just want to acknowledge Dr. Patricia O'Rourke, who supplied me with a lot of the slides on the background of Institutional Review Board and the history. I do use GIS in most of the research I do, but unfortunately I am not paid by any GIS company, so I regret that I have no conflicts of interest to report. So the IRB stands for the Institutional Review Board, and most academic research centers have an IRB. So if you want to do academic research, you have to apply to the Institutional Review Board and get approval to do your research. IRBs historically have been based on biomedical research, so they focus mostly on biomedical research. And the charge has been the oversight of human subjects in research. The federal law defines this as a systematic collection and dissemination of data from or about living human subjects. That's a very broad definition, and you can certainly see a role of geospatial data folding in there. The Institutional Review Board has several members, so the people who decide whether you're allowed to do research or not every time you apply for a research project. It constitutes doctors, either medical doctors or PhDs, oftentimes nurses, someone from chaplaincy frequently sits on them, and there are often there has to be patient representatives as well, either lay people, either from patient perspectives or community members. And then the last point I'll just point out is IRBs are allowed to they're allowed to ask for consultants as well. So if the a research proposal it proposes something that the review board doesn't feel comfortable with, or that they don't have sufficient knowledge about, they will often ask a consultant to sit on the board as well. So everyone in this room, potentially, as geospatial data gets used more and more in biomedical research, may at some point be asked to sit on an IRB board as a consultant. So IRBs and GIS, knowledge of GIS within IRBs really varies a lot by institution, because this is a fairly new field in biomedical research. And moreover, it varies by IRB members. There's currently no consensus at the time on how to manage geospatial data in biomedical research. And overall, there's really a little understanding of what GIS data means and its implications. I have, as I mentioned, I've done about a half dozen research projects so far that have been IRB approved at several different institutions using geospatial data, and the questions I get back from the IRB about how to protect the geospatial data range from nothing to really fairly unsophisticated questions. So really the reason for that is we're juxtaposing traditional medical research with fairly cutting-edge technology. So the tools and sort of the history that IRBs have in terms of how to understand protecting data has not really been stretched to geospatial data yet. So I thought to think a little bit more about this, what we do is we would just take a brief history through the lessons of biomedical research, come to understand how they, through biomedical research, how we've decided to protect patient data through IRBs, and then try and transfer that to how that applies to geospatial data. And again, the overriding principle is the protection of human research subjects. So keep that in mind as we're talking about it. GIS yields a lot of data, which can include subject data as well. And if that data is not protected, the subject can easily be harmed, even if willful harm is not the intent. So, very early on, going back to the 6th century BC, there's reports of experiments on Jewish prisoners being done in the book of Daniel. And then really in the 5th century before Christ, Hippocrates, who was a physician and philosopher, was really the first to come up with this concept of primum non nocere, which is first do no harm, which is still practiced by physicians today. In the 1st century BC, there are reports of experiments where Cleopatra devises experiments to test the theory that it takes 40 days to become a male fetus and 80 days to become a female fetus, which is not correct. She has female prisoners who are condemned to death, sentenced to death. She has them impregnated and subject to operations to open the womb at specific times of gestation. Obviously, this is way before anesthesia, so these are live operations, what we call vivisections. In the 1700s and 1796, Edward Jenner infects an 8-year-old James Phipps with pus taken from cowpox pustule, and he becomes immunized against smallpox. And Jenner's theory was based on folklore that nursemaids, cowmaids who were infected with cowpox, for some reason didn't seem to be developing smallpox. So Jenner tests that on an 8-year-old boy. It turns out that he is protected, immunized against smallpox. He submits his paper to the Royal Academy, and the paper gets rejected, and he is told that his theory is too radical and he needs more proof. So he repeats his experiment on several other children, including his 11-month-old son. And the experiments are successful, and the term vaccine is coined from vacca in Latin. But again, you can start to see how people are being experimented on without their consent. In 1865, another positive step in the history of protecting human subjects, Claude Bernard, who's a French physician, writes in the introduction to the study of human experimentation, never perform an experiment which might be harmful to the patient, even though highly advantageous to science or the health of others. And this is really the first time we begin to see this concept crystallizing of protecting the human subject, even if there's good intent coming out of it. In 1882, Albert Messer injects women with serum from patients with syphilis, and he ends up infecting half of them. Messer goes on to have an illustrious career, and today is known as the discoverer of the bacteria Neisseria gonococcus, which causes gonorrhea in humans. And this is another pattern that we'll see throughout history, where these early medical researchers perform acts, research acts that today would be completely unethical, and then go on to become illustrious physicians or researchers. In 1900, Walter Reed injects 22 Spanish immigrant workers with yellow fever. Each subject signs informed consent and receives $100 if they survive, and $200 if they get to the disease. And so here you have this concept of, is this coercion of some sort? We're going to give you this monetary compensation, which is in 1900 was not a small amount of money. So $100 if they survive, and $200 if they get the disease. That would be seen as coercion. In 1906, Richard Song, who's a U.S. Army medical officer, conducts experiments with cholera on prisoners in the Philippines, which was right after the Spanish-American War. He infects 13 of them. He infects many of them, and 13 of them die. And again, he later goes on to become a professor of tropical medicine at Harvard, and is really one of the founding fathers of tropical medicine. In 1938, Dr. Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa does a study where he takes orphans that are in an orphanage founded for children, orphans of Civil War, soldiers who died in the Civil War, and he induces these orphans who don't stutter to stutter, based on a theory that he wants to show that stuttering is acquired. Dr. Wendell Johnson was actually a stutterer himself. And he actually is successful in this theory. He induces orphans who never stuttered before to stutter, and they go on to have many problems in life. They become isolated. They drop out of school later on. A lot of them run away from the orphanage that was founded to actually help them. Of course, Dr. Johnson goes on to become one of the leading world pathologists, and actually to this day still has a building named after him at University of Iowa. This isn't, these atrocities aren't really limited to the United States. In 1938, during the Sino-Japanese War, Japan establishes Unit 731, which is actually a biomedical warfare unit, but it's disguised as a water purification unit under the leadership of biochemist Dr. Shiro Ishii. And they conduct experiments on Chinese prisoners and the Chinese population, as well as some Russian prisoners, where they do poison gas experiments, they spread aerial chemicals and biological agents, and they conduct vivisections on infected patients. So a vivisection is a surgical dissections basically on live patients without any anesthesia. Obviously, in World War II, we have the Nazi German experiments where they do all sorts of experiments on prisoners of war, as well as children and people in concentration camps. They register all twins for genetic research. They do sterilization experiments, high altitude and low pressure experiments. They infect prisoners and children with infectious diseases. They do freezing experiments, phosphorus burn experiments. They inject seawater into children and prisoners and make them drink seawater. After the Nazi Germany experiments, we actually had the Nuremberg doctor trials of 1946, and this is another sort of key moment where a lot of the doctors and the physicians and the administrators are tried, and it's a testimony of 85 witnesses. Most of the witnesses do not survive. There's over 1,500 documents. And out of the doctor trials comes the Nuremberg Code of 1947, which is one of the foundations that RB information is based on today. And I've summarized the codes here. I'm not going to go through them for the sake of time, but what you'll really see is that if you just sort of look at them briefly, you can see that we're talking about voluntary consent to be a human subject, and the benefit must be greater than the risk. And if you go down to 10, that's sort of another key one as well, where it talks about sort of the onus being on the researcher. If at any point the researcher perceives that the benefits are outweighing the risk, or there's harm is coming about from the research, the research has to be stopped immediately. Tuskegee syphilis study was from the 1930s to 1970s. Basically, this was run a U.S. public health service, so condoned by the government. It was run on 600 black men, and they basically told, they took African-American airmen who were infected with syphilis, and they didn't treat them, and they started to see they basically followed them for 40 years to see what the outcomes were. And treatment was discovered in 1945, penicillin, which worked fairly well, but they withheld that treatment for another 30 years. And 100 patients died of syphilis, as well as the possibility of contracting, the sexual partners contracting the disease and passing the infection on to their children in utero. In 1979, we have the Belmont Report, which is another key time period in history, where they come up with three basic ethical principles: the respect for person, which is the autonomy, basically the concept that the research subject is an autonomous agent, and that there are people who have diminished capacity, who have diminished autonomy, so children, people with illnesses, prisoners, students. These are all people who you have either have some sort of leverage over, or that don't have full capacity to make a rational decision. There's the concept of beneficence, which goes back to the first do no harm. And then there's the concept of justice. If you're going to do research, you have to be fair in the type of subjects that you recruit. You can't just select to do research in wealthy, affluent white people. You also have to give the potential benefits of research to other socioeconomic strata as well, as an example. In 1996, the Health Insurance Protectability and Accountability Act is passed, and that talks about the protection of individually identifiable health information. So how is that relevant to GIS if you are not doing biomedical research? So you think about that. And then I just want to sort of quickly talk about, this is still going on today. As I was preparing for the study, this article came out in the New York Times on the front page above the fold, type of article. Here it's from 2013 in April, so a couple weeks ago. The researchers failed to inform the infant's parents that the risk of participating could involve could involve increased chances of death and blindness. This was an NIH-funded study, National Institutes of Health-funded study, a national study, and over 1,300 infants participated in this study. So by no means have we, are we out of dealing with this issue today. It's still a very active issue. Oversight. So getting back to the IRB, what determines the oversight of the IRB? Federal law, case law, the conditions of the award that you get, and then the media. And I think for geospatial data, I really think there's another element that needs to be folded into this, and that's really the ethics of the researcher. Because this is very much an evolving field, and because traditional IRBs don't really have a grasp of how to protect geospatial data, we're back to the sort of the early stages of biomedical research where we're trying to figure out how to protect the data. And so the onus is on the researcher, I think, to really apply ethical research principles as well. Finally, I just want to sort of use one last example, which is probably more akin to geospatial data. All the prior examples are talking about using human subjects for research without the consent of their actual bodies, but this is a case of someone's data being used without their consent. And it's the case of Henrietta Lacks, who was a woman who in 1951 went to the Johns Hopkins Hospital for a mass in her abdomen. It turned out to be a rare form of endometrial cancer, cervical cancer. And they took biopsies from her tumor and then gave them to another doctor without her consent or her knowledge, who then found out that the cells from her tumor had a really rare quality. They were able to live on and survive in culture, whereas up until then, most cells only survived about a week in culture. Well, her cells survived indefinitely in culture, and they eventually became isolated and became known as the HeLa cell line, which is named after her first and last name. And it's an immortal cell line that's still used today in biomedical research. It's used around the globe, and this is her data. This is her personal information that's still being used today widely in biomedical research that she never consented to or even had knowledge about. Henrietta Lacks eventually died in 1951, shortly thereafter. This makes me think about, are we in a similar situation today with GIS data? Are we collecting GIS data in an era when technology is moving faster than regulation? So are we collecting data on people much like we collected it on Henrietta Lacks that we'll be using years from now that they're not, that the subjects are not aware, participants are not aware of? So GIS, a couple of final slides. GIS really has some unique circumstances and considerations. There are several types of protectable data beyond just traditional biomedical data. Obviously, there's personalized georeference data. Once you have this, you can get, as we saw from the students, you can easily get someone's home, someone's street, someone's census tract, zip code, state, country, etc. Once you have their census tract information, you can get all their sociodemographic data. You can get their average family income from the census data. You can get their race, their ethnicity. You can link their data to a simple web search, and all of a sudden I can get your phone number. I can see who your family members are. I can even get information on your personal background, maybe your political affiliation. We can get criminal history, even medical history. And then if you add in GPS data, you can get their location. You can get purchasing patterns, maybe maybe if there's a restraining order or anything like that, or you could get all sorts of information whether they're violating their parole. So I think to sum up, it's still an evolving field. Most IRBs still do not grasp the implications of GIS-based research, and so until we figure a lot of these issues out, the onus will remain on the researchers to conduct ethical research and handle the data in ethical, proper, protected manners. I think at this time we have a lot of questions, but we don't have that many answers. And I think what we can do is draw on some of the lessons from biomedical research to really formulate our standards on how IRB data should regulate GIS-based research. Thank you.